Have you ever wondered where God is when you don't know what to do? When you're struggling with the forces of evil or the things around you that you just don't quite understand? It doesn't matter whether you believe you're at fault or whether someone else is at fault or whether you've been treated unjustly or even whether you deserve maybe some judgment, but nothing like this, you might think. Or have you ever asked, where are you, God? I need to hear from you. Jeremiah is about to remind Judah that God has not moved, nor has he neglected his people. He's going to share with them that he clearly speaks to them. Brother Bob read to you out of the center of the 38th chapter, but this story begins much earlier in the book of Jeremiah than that. This is just the point where we began to come to a conclusion, because the voice of the Lord is very clear and very distinctive when he begins to speak to our heart. Oftentimes the problem is we're not willing to hear what he has to say. If you go back to the 37th chapter, you'll find early in that Zedekiah, son of Josiah, reigned as the king of the land of Judah in the place of Jehoiakim, son of Jehoiakim, of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made him king. He and his officers and his people of the land did not obey the words of the Lord that he spoke through Jeremiah the prophet. Verse 37, or chapter 37, tells us very early that Jeremiah had already spoken to them, but things did not get better. Matter of fact, if you will look in the scriptures, you will find that they didn't like the message of Jeremiah, so they just put him in jail. That's a little dangerous for preachers, isn't it? You'll find earlier in the book of Jeremiah that once they didn't like his message, and they dug a hole and they put him in the ground. It was dangerous to tell folks sometimes what they don't want to hear. But Jeremiah was still persistent in claiming that. And he was telling them, listen, unless you return to the Lord, your fate is going to be the same as the brethren of the northern kingdom. You see, the northern kingdom of Israel had already been carried away into captivity for disobeying God. And now here Judah, the southern provinces where Jerusalem was at, was in the same danger. Now Isaiah had preached to those in the northern kingdom over and over, and they did not hear the voice of God, and it looks like they would have learned from those mistakes. But Judah still was having the same problems, and they were not listening to God. But finally they came to a place that the king said, man, we're in a lot of trouble. And he was absolutely right. Have you ever gotten there? Somebody told me one day they just woke up and, man, the world was falling apart. And I told them that it had been falling apart a long time before they woke up that morning. We just don't recognize that sometimes, do we? And in this 37th chapter, what we begin to see here is there's a conflict occurs because we want to hear from God, but we only hear what we want to hear. But Jeremiah had told them clearly what was happening. So let's examine how God speaks to us in that way, because God does speak, doesn't he? Clearly he does that. Zedekiah had a question. He called Jeremiah over, and you'll find that in verse 17 of that 37th chapter. And it's an interesting, and I'm reading out of the Holman Christian Standard this morning, but here the question is very clear. It says, King Zedekiah later sent for him. This was after he was already in jail, and received him in his house privately and asked him, is there a word from the Lord? Is there something I need to know? Now Jeremiah responded to him, and listen, wow, it was a terrible thing at that point as they saw it. Jeremiah had been in prison on the charges of conspiring against Judah. They had found him in the gates of the city, and the enemies were on the outside. And they looked at him, and they didn't like what he had said, they didn't like what he was saying, and they didn't like him at all because he had spoken the truth to them. He had literally delivered the word of the Lord. And here he came in this particular situation, and they were there. And he was scared, and what was he going to do? And they said, well, listen, he's going to go out and he's going to join the Chaldeans. You see, there were others that were there because Zedekiah is going to be worried about that later, isn't he? Of all of his people who had tried to serve God or had just gotten out of town when everything began to get bad. And so here he was, and they said, well, listen, he's going to the other side. He's going to become a traitor. We got to fix this. And so they took him and they threw him in prison at that time. But here the king finally said, listen, there is no voice of God speaking. Oh, yeah, there was. They just weren't listening. And finally the king began to understand. that Jeremiah had been the voice of God all that time. He had openly told the nation that their sins against God was a problem. Matter of fact, Jerusalem and Judea were in some serious trouble. Look at what verse 6 and 7 says in that chapter. In verse 37, it tells us very clearly they were in some real problems. It says, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. This is what you will say to Judah's king, who is sending you to inquire of me. Watch. Pharaoh's army, which has come out to help you, is going to return to its own land of Egypt. The Chaldeans will then return and fight against this city. They will capture it and burn it down. And this is what the Lord says. Don't be deceiving yourself by saying the Chaldeans will leave us for good, for they will not leave. They will not. What had they done? Well, instead of depending on God, they went down to Egypt and they hired some mercenaries. And they said, listen, we think maybe this is the solution to our problem. We'll get somebody else involved that doesn't know God either. Now, that doesn't fix anything, does it? But here they were having this problem. And it was the darkest moment. Only in that darkest moment when the king knew that there was no place else to go but God, did he call on the prophet. Is there a word from the Lord? He said. I hope you've never been there when you've ignored what God has said over and over. When you have not sought him until that crisis moment. Now let me tell you, it's still okay to seek him in that crisis moment. God is still there. And that's one thing this tells us. And we can't fix past problems, can we? I love what sometimes they do. You know, investing is not real good now in some ways. But remember when they give you those investment things and those stock commercials are on the financial networks. I don't know if you ever watch those or not, or even on TV. And they've got that little disclaimer at the bottom. And it says past performance are not indicative of future performance. What happened in the past is not necessarily going to continue to repeat itself in the future, but what it does do is they will tell you, it will indicate some trends. When you don't listen to God, there is a trend. And that trend is you're probably not going to listen later. And God knows that. But God has a way of getting our attention, doesn't he? So he reveals that he perpetually speaks, that God is never silent. He tells them, listen, you want a word from me? You want to know what God is saying? God is saying, listen, I'm going to tell you, and I have continued to tell you. How does God speak to us? How do we know what God is doing in our life? How do we understand those things? Well, first of all, God speaks through his word, doesn't he? When we have neglected his word, we have shut off part of his voice. I remember watching a child one day, and the parent was telling them what they needed to do. And you know what the child did? I don't want to hear it. I'm sure some of you that have been teachers have had children who may have done the same thing, or turned their back, or turned away. I don't want to hear it. And then, you know what the excuse is? When they didn't have their homework, when they did bad on the test or anything? Well, I didn't know that. When did you say that? You say, well, I would never do that, but yet I've stood up here, and Donna did this morning, and told you about things that were happening at church, and something happens in church that I didn't know that. Sometimes we just don't pay attention, do we? Is anybody guilty of that? Don't raise your hand. Okay? We are sometimes, aren't we? We're guilty of those things, but God speaks through his word, and the one thing you've got to be absolutely sure of is that God intended for us to read his word, or he would not have sent us his word.